Good afternoon, everyone. I think now is the perfect time to start my webinar, Raising Resilient Minds, Nurturing Emotional Growth in Children. My name is Meher Motial. I'm an alumnus of EtonHouse International School Broadrick, and I'm very pleased to be here to moderate this conversation on a topic that I know resonates with so many of us. Whether your child is 18 months or 18 years old, understanding and managing emotions is an essential part of growing up. So today we're going to explore how emotional regulation evolves through the years and what role we as adults can play in supporting that process. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by two experts who bring different but equally valuable perspectives to this conversation. First up, we are joined by Steve Gallego, who is stepping in for Ms. Dimas. We're very lucky to have Steve with us today. Steve is the principal of Middleton International School, who will be sharing his educational leadership perspective on this important topic. Hi, Steve.
Hello there. Pleased to meet you.
We're pleased to have you here. And secondly, we have Kavita Manukaran, who is a senior clinical psychologist at the International Medical Clinic, and she will be offering insights from a mental health and clinical standpoint. Hi, Kavita.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here to contribute to this.
I know that we're definitely looking forward to it. Let's begin with, diving in and addressing them. So to begin with, let's talk about why emotional regulation is so important and how it can look very different at the various stages of childhood. So Steve, could you start off by giving us an overview of how emotional development typically progresses in early and primary years?
All right, thank you. I think the most important thing to say at this stage is that it happens with a different timeline according to the child. So we need to be sensitive to that, and we need to ensure that we're not setting unrealistic expectations or comparing with other children too much, allow them time to develop. But I mean, typically when children join us, they don't necessarily know what emotions are. So in which case they can't identify particularly which emotion they're experiencing. And it is a case of experiencing and reacting just in the way that they feel that they should. But as they move through early childhood and primary years, they obviously start to understand what emotions are, what an emotion is, and then what emotion am I feeling at the moment? And then that can start to lead to situations where they can self-regulate and think, well, how am I able to deal with this emotion at this particular point? They may even start to be able to predict emotions before they happen, which will help them to regulate in a way that they're happy with.
It's beautiful. Thank you. I love how you said that, there is no one size fits all journey or timeline, and how it's really just about gauging with your child and seeing where they're at, and how, through school, through our roles as adults and, as parents, just helping them recognize their emotions, sometimes even before they arise. And then if we were to move along in the journey, Kavita, how does this change as children enter adolescence, and what are some common emotional challenges that you see in older children or teens?
Yeah. So like Steve said, it's about meeting the child where they are at the moment. So if you think about your adolescent stage, this is when they want a lot more independence. This is when they also hit puberty. They're going through puberty as they move towards adulthood, right? So there's puberty, there's hormonal changes in their body. They have more independence. They want to do things on their own. So some of the emotional changes you'll realize is that they'll be more quiet. They'll be more withdrawn from everyone around them, to the point where it may be hard to predict what emotion are you facing. But they are going through changes. They'll go through changes from anger to rage. They'll go through changes from happy to being very ecstatic, or even the other way around. So the emotions get more intensified in here. And they start also feeling more emotions, a wider range of emotions as they head towards young adulthood. Right? You'll see a lot more disappointed, a lot more frustrated. So the emotional wheel becomes a lot bigger at this stage.
That's beautiful. I'm sure that we've all experienced that, where through our teenagers, suddenly everything feels so much more intense, and and like the volume on all of our emotions gets turned up. And like you said, even though when children do enter this phase of their lives, even though their emotions are getting more intense, like you said, they'll often process it independently, privately. And I'm sure that that can make it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure that that makes it harder for parents to detect their children's emotional needs as they get older.
Yes, yes. It is very difficult sometimes in adolescent stage, and I think Steve will contribute later for the younger stages, right? Adolescent stage, when they're more withdrawn, they're more independent. Parents are pretty much predicting what's going on, with them, especially with teenagers that do not show their emotions on their face. You pretty much have to find out through clues, like, for example, facial clues, the behavior clues that they get around the house, and through conversations that you can have with them when you are having a good time, in a calm time. Yeah.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. So I guess these are the ways that parents can, like you said, pick up on the clues and pick up on the signs. Even if they're not let into the whole barrage of emotions, they can pick up on the droplets. So now that we've set the scene, we've understood how emotional development progresses through the years, let's dive into recognizing big emotions. So specifically, let's talk about emotional triggers. What does emotional dysregulation look like at different ages? And how can parents recognize when their child is overwhelmed? So if we could, start with Kavita, and then would love to hear from you, Steve.
So emotional regulation for adolescents, I think it can look like they mainly looks like stress, anxiety, a lot more shutdowns, right? Or very extreme outbursts. For example, they scream and shout towards parents. There's a lack of respect for people around them. Yeah. So anxiety and stress sometimes can also come out through psychosomatic concerns. So basically, stomach aches, headaches, shoulder aches, to the extreme will be vomiting, sensations like that, right? And there is no medical concern for that. It is from stress and anxiety, correct? And sometimes that can be difficult to identify in that sense, because sometimes people see that as a physical difficulty when it's actually related to the emotional dysregulation. Whereas compared to younger children, it's a little bit different. Yeah. It's common in that sense, but with teenagers, it is more related to stress and anxiety. Yeah.
That makes so much sense. They say the body keeps the score, the body stores it all, right? So, and then I think if we were to, take a few steps back into our childhood, Steve, what does emotional dysregulation look like there? And once again, how can parents recognize when their child is overwhelmed, when they're, in the primary years?
In terms of triggers, I don't think that they are so different for younger children in relation to older children. They tend to revolve around anxiety, as Kavitha is saying. The anxiety may come from an instability or a lack of security. That's one of the main things that we see. When their environment is stable and predictable, then you tend to have less triggers, less emotional difficulties. If there's an anxiety about what's going to happen next, because the environment is the child views it as unstable, then different emotions can come out, and they will be different according to the child. I think that the other thing that stimulates emotion is the child's sense of fairness. And this is very much the case for young children, 3-year-olds. They have they view that life should be fair. They don't have a concept of unfairness. Why should it be unfair? This is not okay. But actually, strangely, that doesn't go away. And teenagers have a huge sense of justice and injustice, and will maybe perhaps react in different ways. But it's those sorts of triggers that cause the issues. You're smiling. I'm sure everybody's smiling on the call because we know this. And even as adults, we find this sort of thing tricky. Children react in different ways. Some children will react aggressively. They'll feel anger, outrage, and that will come out in terms of shouting. It could be physical aggression. I guess that's more towards the younger end of the scale, but that can certainly happen in terms of teenagers. But then others, of course, shut down. Others are not confrontational characters. They freeze, they withdraw. So those are the sorts of things to look at. Some are very obvious, some are less obvious. But parents generally know their children and generally can see when they're suffering like that.
That makes total sense. And like you said, instability can sometimes stimulate emotion or, like emotional triggers. So if we could zoom into that, and if I could, if we could get your opinion, both of your opinions on, what are the specific situations, like for example, transitions or social dynamics, like Steve, how you just mentioned, when there's injustice, like an injustice takes place. But to zoom into that, what are some more examples of specific situations that tend to trigger stronger emotions? If we could hear from you, Steve, and then from you, Kavita.
I think that the situations that trigger stronger emotions are the situations that matter most to children. If the theme is of little importance, then the emotion will be lesser. But if it's something that is very important to them, then the emotion will be strong. So as adults, we need to know our children, whether we be teachers or whether we are parents, we need to know what matters to our children. I mean, if a child is particularly interested in the food they eat, if that's important to them, they look forward to their meal times, whether it be because of the specific food they eat or because of the social environment of sitting down to eat. If we suddenly take away something from them that they're expecting, that could create an emotional reaction. But for other children, that might not make any difference at all. Oh, never mind. We're not doing that anymore. Not a problem. So it's about knowing our children and predicting where they'll find those difficulties. And once we know where they're, what's important to them, then we try to make the environment predictable. So we set clear expectations, so they know what's going to happen next, and in their mind, it's predictable. Routines can help with those clear expectations. Most children like the safety of a routine. They may complain that things are boring at times, but actually they appreciate knowing what's coming next so they can prepare for it. Yeah, and then the environment that they're in, the physical environment, those sorts of changes can cause anxiety. So it's putting all those pieces together in order that the children feel safe and secure.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. And then how does that transform, Kavita? Like, what specific situations can then elicit strong emotional reactions, for teenagers?
So as they transition into adolescence, so some of the common themes that are very important in their lives will be friendships and relationships with each other, with teachers, with the parents, with siblings, a general one, or even if it's like an intimate relationship in the later adolescent stage. Academics, it becomes a little bit more important. There are more examinations. There is an ambition there to head towards too. Right? Also lifestyle. So if you notice, a lot of the emotions are also tied into current trends on social media that happens, or the hashtags that come out. The use of phone can elicit very big emotions with adolescents, right? The need for a phone, the use for a phone, right? So lifestyle related activities as well, like missing out on maybe a spot that they like, can create intense emotions, equally as much as their friend not inviting them out for an outing. Yeah. Now, the other thing that we also need to think about is parents and their actions also can create a lot of emotions in adolescents. They're in a stage where small things can irritate them in that sense. And the people closest to them sometimes feel the end of the emotion, right? So parents especially will say, I cannot understand what's going on, but she's just upset and scolding us or doesn't want to talk to us, right? So there are quite a few things if you look at it in the adolescent stage.
No, 100%. Thank you. And so I think a common thread that we're hearing from both you, Steve, and Kavita is that, through both the primary and adolescent years, parents play a big part in creating that stability for their children, whether it's through establishing routines, or whether it's through being mindful and understanding of these emotional outbursts. And so if we could then next dive into the role of parents in co-regulation. So now that we've understood and recognized these emotional states, how can parents support their children in regulating their emotions at all stages? And specifically, what does co-regulation look like in practice?
Okay. One of my favorite words is balance, and I'm going to use it today because we have to strike a middle ground between care and also enabling children to develop resilience. What I've found increasingly over 25 years of working in international education is that parents have changed, and more parents are trying to remove those negative stimuli from their children's lives in order to look after them, which is a wonderful thing to do. We want our children to enjoy a fantastic childhood, but at the same time, we're also potentially removing learning experiences where they're able to develop resilience, because at the end of the day, they need to be able to do these things for themselves. So at one end of the scale, you have that helicoptering, doing everything for your child, and then as a consequence, no resilience and no real learning of how to do this for yourself. And at the other end of the scale, you've got neglect, where we don't actually help our children and the children have to figure it out for themselves. And I think that there is a middle ground to be had here, where we know our children and their stage of development, because it's going to look different according to where they are, but give them enough scaffolding in order that they have the care that they need at the moment to get through the moment, but they have opportunity to learn to do things themselves and become independent, if that makes sense.
That makes so much sense. And I, what you said reminded me of when I went to EtonHouse. We had this whole topic that was dedicated to conflict resolution. And I think that struck such a beautiful balance of, like you said, acknowledging that there will be conflict, that that's an inevitable part of life. And there's no, it's, although the intention is pure of wanting to remove conflict for, children and for ourselves, it's just part of life. So I think, and at the same time, we want to prepare them for conflict and how to assert themselves and hold their own. And I think specifically with this conflict resolution topic, what we were made to do is we were supposed to simulate, like typical arguments that we have, where, for example, I was partnered with somebody and they stole my pencil as part of the role play, and then I was taught some phrases that I could say and vice versa that we could say to each other. And the main idea was to learn how to navigate through conflict without assigning blame and without pointing fingers, but just coming to a beautiful solution. So to reintroduce that sort of, and I know this is specific, this is more specific to conflict resolution externally than it is to internal emotional regulation, but either way, striking that balance between understanding that there might be things that that can trigger us and our children, but then equipping them with the resources they need to push through it and to advocate for themselves through it. And Kavita, how does that then, how does that develop?
So I think, like Steve said, it's about the balance, right? Finding when to let them learn it on their own and when to help them. But in adolescence, as you move towards adolescence, the co-regulation involves two people, the parents, the child, the friends, and the child. So modeling is a very important one. They watch by learning as well, if you think about it. So they're watching the world around them, they're watching the people around them. How are you regulating their emotions, correct? So you are showing your kids, essentially the parents are showing your kids, this is how I'm regulating the emotions. And that's one big way that they help to co-regulate the child's emotions as well, right? And another one is having conversations about it, healthy conversations about it, because the adolescents want to express themselves, but they need a bit of guidance on how to express it, right? And the best people to do that is with parents, the ones that you can speak to when you need any form of help, right? So having conversations around it without judgment of the emotion, that it's okay to feel it, and this is what we can do and all that. I feel like these two are very important in co-regulating with the adolescents. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm piecing together what you were saying before, also of how like when children then go into adolescence, they have more of a desire to want to do it on their own. So, they have more of a desire to drive the car. So, they might not be, correct me if I'm wrong, but they might not be as open to wanting to be taught. But at the same time, we're always subconsciously soaking in our parents' influence. So that's why modeling comes into place. And in this vein, what are some common mistakes or misconceptions that parents may have about co-regulation?
I think that one issue is when parents feel compelled to intervene, but the child is not necessarily ready to receive that support. I'm probably bordering onto Kavitha's domain here, but I do know that when a child is extremely dysregulated, their earlobe closes and they're not able to receive instruction at that point, even if they try. And at that point, it actually doesn't matter what you say. It's not going to go in and they're not going to be able to process. And so co-regulation, you have to choose the right moment. When they're significantly dysregulated, actually the job may just be to make sure that they're safe in that moment, that they're not going to run away, that they're not going to do anything silly. You may be in the room, you may be close to the room. It might just be a hand on the back to know that you're there. And that is as much as you can do at that point. And as parents, we may need to, or as adults, we may need to be patient in order to wait for the moment where our intervention to start to co-regulate, start to speak to them comes. Kavitha, I'll be interested to know how you feel about that.
So I think that is what I wanted to introduce as holding space, where as adults, we need to hold the space for them to feel that emotion. Like just now, Steve, you mentioned, right? Not to jump into problem solving so quickly, but hold that space to feel that emotion. And I agree with Steve. I think one of the, I wouldn't call it errors, but just one thing that we need to be more mindful about as adults is when someone's in a heightened emotion state, it is very difficult to do anything at that stage. The best thing we can do is ensure the child is safe, be next to them for support and safety, but trying to talk to them, trying to intervene at that stage, it's closed. They're not really hearing what it is. They're very in their body, in the moment itself, right? So that's one thing where we need to give some space to wait. Yeah. So the patience in dealing with the emotions is the other thing that we tend to overlook, because these are kids that are developing and growing. They're still developing, which means their emotions will vary as well according to the developments. So we need to find the time and the space to be able to do this, especially with our very busy schedules now. Sometimes parents forget that it's okay to just sit there for half an hour with my child and let them go through what they're going through. Yeah.
I'll jump on and build on this to talk about how we also regulate ourselves in these situations, especially parents, because when you're dealing with your own children, it's quite emotional for you. It can be, as a parent myself, I know that it can be very heartening when things are going well for your child. It can make you really happy. When your child is sad, it can make you feel extremely sad. And when your child is shouting things at you that are disrespectful and unhelpful, that can also make you more angry than if perhaps somebody else's child was behaving like that towards you. And the way that we respond plays a big role in dictating what happens next and the emotions of our child. So if they're angry and even if we're saying the right things, but if our tone of voice and our body language is angry back, the likelihood is we're going to stimulate even more anger. But we have to balance that and try to ensure that we are self-regulated and we are dictating the tone of the conversation, if that's what we're having.
So beautiful. So this is for both you, Steve and Kavita, because it seems that, like you just said, parents modeling what, regulation looks like can be very helpful for children. So what are some, like tips that you could give? Like, for example, let's just say that you're in the moment, your child is upset, you're getting frustrated, tempers are rising. What are some just practical tips that you could do, like whether it's a breathing exercise or whatever it may be? What are some tips that you could share with our parents today?
And the key is identifying emotion for me. If you don't identify the emotion you're in, then there isn't very much chance of you self-regulation. Self-regulating. You're just then relying on tacit kind of reactive responses of how you feel you should be behaving, which of course over time will develop and will help. So, I mean, there are useful tools, resources that are readily available online that teachers and parents can use to help their children to be able to identify which emotion they're in. There are some resources that kind of group emotions, because of course there's a myriad of many different emotions, and you can group into different categories. And it's teaching children to be able to feel their bodies, feel their emotion, identify where they're at. So that's kind of one half of it. And then being able to equip children with strategies or ideas as to what to do when they experience each emotion. So, I mean, breathing is one way to go, which will suit some people, and other people won't want to do that. And that's absolutely fine. But there again, breathing is something that might work when you're angry, but it might not be a strategy you want to apply when you're excited. So the first half of identifying where you are then relates to the second half as to what you might do.
Yeah, if I can add on to that, once you've identified where you are, like you said, because sometimes different emotions can require different strategies as well, right? So I usually will tell parents to adopt the take a pause. Even if the pause is just to stand there in quiet, facing each other to identify what's going on. And if you can't do that, then take a pause might also mean walking away, walking out, walking into nature, walking into the room, drinking water, and all of these strategies, correct? Because I think if you don't pause the moment at that point, then escalation will happen in terms of emotions, right? Then it gets very difficult. You forget where you started sometimes, right? So to add on to what Steve said, I would usually suggest take a pause and then see what suits you in that moment. Is it just to sit and do breathing? Is it to take a walk, drink some cold water? Simple strategies that don't require extra tools. Yeah.
So beautiful. Because like I remember you were mentioning before that when we're in a heightened state of emotion, it's very hard to, first of all, it's important to feel that, like you said, and to hold space for that instead of jumping into problem solving, because I'm sure that a big part of healing is validating your emotions and going through it instead of jumping straight to the it's okay part, because what about the it's not okay part that needs to be done first? So there's taking a pause, like you said, Steve, there's naming the emotion, to regain a sense of sovereignty and control over it. So, we've already gotten such beautiful tips. So let's go into our next session where we expand on these practical takeaways. So what are some age-appropriate strategies that parents can use to support emotional development at home? And now I'm talking about just cultivating a sense of emotional awareness, of regulation, in general. How do we cultivate that emotionally healthy lifestyle for our children?
I think if we start off at the bottom end with young children, stories are really helpful. We can use stories where characters experience emotion, and we can analyze those stories and look at how characters respond, and look at the consequences of their response. And when I say consequence, I mean positive consequences. They did this and it worked for them, and this is the situation that arose as a result, and also the negative consequences. And young children love stories, and they have great empathy for characters, and they're very able to feel the emotions of characters. So if we can help them to unpack those stories at an age-appropriate level, they can really help. And then, of course, at the end of the story, you can relate back to the children's lives, and you could ask them, well, have you ever experienced a moment like that? Did you behave in the same way as the character? Did you do better, or did the character do something that you could learn from? So I think that's really useful for young children, and they'll enjoy it as well. This hopefully should be an enjoyable activity. But to segue into perhaps Kavitha talking about older children and adolescents, the funny thing is that this sort of thing will work to an extent for older children if done differently, because often teenagers don't want to talk about their own emotions. Because of that development of learning the social world and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, this starts to make things more difficult, because they will try to hide some emotions because they've learned that perhaps the social world will see it as unacceptable. So how do we actually help them? And sometimes a helpful way of helping older teenagers is to direct it away from them. Don't talk about them and their emotions. Talk about somebody else and how badly they're handling something. Or it's much easier to talk about somebody else and what they're doing wrong than what you're doing wrong. And that actually can help them better understand the same thing, what they're doing and what the consequences are, and what will work and make the situation better and what will not.
I think, sorry, Kavita, I have a quick question to jump in with. I think to actually, no, you know what? Let's hear from you first. I'll save my question for later.
No problem. Just to add on to Steve, right? What he said, to direct the emotions away from themselves, right? So some practical tips I would suggest usually for adolescents regulating, because they're a little bit more cognitively mature, they're getting cognitively mature in the adolescence. You can consider very simple things like journaling or even mindfulness techniques, right? Something that they can do independently on their own. But another one that we cannot forget is movement. So movement in terms of dance and expression, sports, and feeling a team sense as well. So movement is also very good in terms of regulating the emotions for adolescents. Yeah.
I think that's such a beautiful point, because I personally am definitely somebody who experiences a lot of big emotions, just personality wise as an artist, even now in my my 20s. And I definitely remember that through high school I was very active. My parents definitely modeled that for me. EtonHouse had so many opportunities, same with my high school. And I think that definitely helped me expel whatever stress there was from school or friendships, like you said, Kavita, because those are the main, those are the main important parts. But so yes, to return to the question and to build off of what both of you just said, Steve, like you mentioned before, for parents, of course, I'm sure that nobody cares more for their children than parents do themselves. And that's why it can be so hard to detangle, our own emotions, like parents' own emotions, as in like when their children are happy, they're so happy, when they're sad, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, Kavita, you mentioned that it's important to provide a non-judgmental space. So my question is that how do parents provide that non-judgmental space where they're able to create that space for their children's emotions and thoughts and opinions to be laid out, and keep their own emotions maybe separate? How do and you know, how do parents go about creating that space?
Wow, that's about 4 questions in one. 4 things to do in one. I mean, I think that if we replay this video and listen to those comments that you're making, we start to appreciate how difficult parenthood is. You know, I think that the most important thing is to create a high trust environment at home. It's easy to say. It's not so easy to do because life's challenging. And as I've mentioned, your own children's behavior and emotions are going to likely evoke the strongest emotions in you. It's much easier for us in school with other people's children. In fact, sometimes as parents, we joke when our children are playing with other people's children and parents' houses, and they tell us how wonderful they are, and when we decide, well, we'll just swap, and it would be a lot easier if we just swapped children and brought up somebody else's. But how do we build that high trust environment? And that is it's a process of building up trust through reactions. So I mean, if a child is coming up and asking us questions, if we dismiss them, it's going to build a culture of feeling like that my comments aren't going to be validated and I'm not going to be listened to. So if we're at a difficult moment where we're busy with work and we dismiss, unfortunately, that's going to cause an issue. If a child's particularly sensitive about feeling sensitive about something, feeling particularly emotional about something, and we dismiss and say, "Oh, well, that's nothing to be upset about. You know, I don't know what the big problem is here." Then again, you're lowering that threshold of trust, and the child is not likely to go back and share those feelings again. So yes, it's that not being judgmental and validating. Then once you've validated, then I think you are then looking to try to navigate the conversation in order to try to support and help them see sense. Because it might be that their emotion reaction is unreasonable in our opinion, and we want to help the children see that. But without validating it first and telling them, well done for speaking to me, and I can completely understand that. And I felt like that too in the past. Yeah, absolutely right. Before doing that, you need to go through that process prior to unpacking it and then maybe making sense of it and coming to the realization that maybe it isn't so dramatic after all.
Yeah, if I can just add, Meher, if that's okay. Yeah, so the validation is very important, like what Steve said, right? But I think parents also have to remember that you are also a feeling person. You're going to have reactions as well. And it's not about controlling it, but it's about expressing it in a healthy way because the kids are watching you as well. You don't want to be someone who's so flat that they're not picking up anything from you, right? So you want to give an opportunity for the child to also validate your feeling, to say, oh, you're feeling angry or you're doing this, you know? So on top of the validation, on top of feeling all these emotions in the relationship, it's also about doing follow-up, right? Follow up. If you can't do it at the moment itself, like Steve said, like you're working, you're so tired, so much going on, but just to be mindful to keep it there and follow up. If it's even the next day, that's okay, right? Because you want to go back and address it. You don't want to be putting it at the back burner and ignoring it. Yeah.
So beautiful. And Steve, to come back to something you said about how, you know, if we were to rewatch this webinar, we would see how, you know, nuanced and how big a job it is to be a parent. And so I do want to just pause for a minute and really thank all of you for being here, including, of course, you, Steve and Kavita, as well as our attendees, because I'm sure, of course, I don't personally know, but I'm sure I've seen that parenthood is such an incredible job. It's an everyday job. And the fact that you are here, you know, I'm sure that your children are so lucky to have parents that care so much for their emotional well-being, that recognize the importance of nurturing that beyond just, our academic well-being and our physical well-being. So thank you so much for being here. And I am seeing some questions in the chat. We will get to a question and answer round shortly before we, summarize this. And I think from this section, the main takeaway is that, like you said, Kavita, there's absolutely nothing wrong with parents having their own emotions and opinions. And it's important for them to express them, once again, coming back to that modeling, so that they can model what that looks like, what healthy emotional expression looks like. And at the same time, whatever our opinions may be, it's also important to validate our children's emotions and what they're going through. Because somebody once told me this story of how, I think it was my dad. My dad is, very tall, very, very tall man. And I remember, obviously, as a kid, I was small, and there was a puddle in front of me. And to me, the puddle was a river. It was an ocean. It was so big, and I was scared to cross it. But from my dad's point of view, he could see that it was just a puddle. And I'm sure that this translates to a lot of experiences where, for parents, we can see that the threat is not as intimidating as our child may view it to be, that this is something they'll forget in a year or 2 years' time. So holding space for that, that grounding where it's like, it will be okay, but also that space for that validation. If I understand that it looks like an ocean to you from your height, from your age, from what you know so far. So thank you so much for sharing all of this. Just, now to begin wrapping the session up. Sometimes parents do everything they can, but things still feel challenging. So when should parents consider seeking additional support?
Parents should seek additional support when they themselves feel too emotional or unable to regulate themselves enough to support their children. So I think that there's definitely a sense of self-awareness there, and knowing when you yourself need to reach out. Yeah, then there's the difficult side of when you feel like your child may need additional help over and above the norm for that age, or over and above what you feel that you can provide. But that's a much more difficult question, because as we're rewinding right back to the start of this discussion, we talked about the fact that stages of development are very different for all children. And so you can't just look at a chart and track where they should be and say, oh, they're off track, so let's do something about this. So I think that what I recommend from a school's perspective is that if you feel like that could be the case for your child, the first step is to go to speak to the child's homeroom teacher. Certainly, any good school will have a system whereby the homeroom teachers will be open to those sorts of discussions. For younger children, it sometimes, if you're dropping them at the gate, that it's possible to speak to the teacher on exit, but I would suggest reach out, book an appointment. Teachers will always be happy to receive and to chat. And you just might find that everything's absolutely fine, and that the child's functioning really well at school, and you're just a little bit more worried because it's your child and you don't know how it should be. But on the other hand, we need to triangulate, and we see part of the story at school, you see part of the story at home. And it's not until you join those dots that you actually see the full picture. So coming along and chatting to the teacher can really help both teacher and parent understand what's happening, and knowing whether there is an increased level of support necessary. So collaboration.
Beautiful, thank you. And Kavita?
So I think I'll come from a psychological perspective, right? So young age, even as young as 3-4 years old, right? When you have emotional regulation difficulties, parents will put in techniques, behaviors, they'll try to manage them. So the fine line of identifying when should you approach the teachers, when should you approach a counselor or psychologist, is when the functioning is affected, when the lifestyle is affected. So sleep, eating, you're not able to do your usual recommended lifestyle as a family. The child is not sleeping well, not performing well, seems to be crying a lot, or increase in outbursts. Sometimes when they're younger, we will look at also regression. So if like a 12-year-old starts carrying a doll around every day, right? So regression to a much younger age, correct? So things that do not make sense for that particular age group in that sense, right? And if you don't know what to look for because it's your only child or it's your first child and all, you can look at the other kids around them as well to see where does my child stand, right? But the one area that I'll highlight with emotional regulation is also risk behaviors, when they do things that are very risky to them, right? Self-harm, suicide, anything major like that, they should get immediate help for their child and themselves as parents as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Steve and Kavita, for these very, specific signs. And we've covered so much valuable ground, and now I'd love to open this up to our attendees' questions. So now we'll be taking some questions from our live audience. And if we don't get to your questions today, don't worry, we will be following up with some additional resources after the session. So to begin with, let's start with the question, what is the best way to calm a child wanting to hurt themselves when they get very upset? Like you just mentioned, Kavita, the high risk self-harm behavior. So either, by scratching themselves, hitting their head against something, or by pulling their own hair. So what is the best way to calm a child in this state? Either Steve or Kavita, whoever.
So depending on the age of the child, if they are younger children and if they are doing things like that, the first thing to do is safety. So holding them, making sure they're not harming themselves, right? But not holding them to the point where you're suffocating them or anything. So ensuring safety. If it's in an area where they can injure themselves, then moving them somewhere else where it's safer and quieter. Correct. So I would suggest that first, but then also giving them that safer space to regulate deep breaths or using a punching bag to punch whatever that they are feeling, So instead of taking it out onto themselves or the people around them, they take out that anger and the difficulties onto something else, like a pillow or a punching bag usually, right? So that's one of the strategies I would suggest.
Okay, beautiful. And then once again, this is for either Steve or Kavita. What are some age-appropriate strategies to help children navigate disappointment and failure in healthy ways? Coming back to building resilience, like you were saying, Steve. So what are some ways that they can navigate disappointment and failure in healthy ways?
I think that conversations with the child help regarding this. When you are experiencing an emotion like that, they tend to need to come out in some shape or form. And we'd rather they didn't come out in terms of a physical violence against somebody else, or so we're looking for it to come out, but in a safe way. And conversations can help. And if a child gets frustrated and starts shouting, then that's okay, actually. And it will help them to release that emotion. A strategy that I often use when we're in difficult situations is to allow the other person to talk and to talk and to talk and to talk and to talk as much as they want. And even if they stop momentarily, to try to prompt them to do it again, because the more they talk, the more the emotion comes out. And actually, the more it will start to become under control. And then once they've talked out as much as they want to talk out, or you sense that they need to, then that's the moment that you can start to come in and ask open questions, rather than closed questions or closed comments of yes, that's really, really bad. Just open questions to help them to think, and that in turn is helping them. It's scaffolding to help them to become more independent, because they're actually starting to resolve it themselves, just with those open questions, that scaffolding from you at that moment.
Beautiful. So guiding them to their own answers from within versus feeding them answers.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bit of empathy to say, oh, I understand totally why you're so upset about that. But getting them to express and prompting them to analyze through open questions.
Wonderful. And then I think we will now move on to, so I see that there are questions in the chat, but I think we'll move on to live questions. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask their questions, please feel free to now, just to keep it more interactive. And we would love to hear your voice, hear from you. And also, you know what, maybe it's, what I'll do for now is I'll read 2 more questions from the chat, and we'll see if people feel comfortable asking the questions live. I understand if the chat feels, safe and more comfortable. So one more question is, how can we as parents foster open communication without overwhelming our children with adult concerns?
I mean, that would go back to building that high trust environment. You're not going to get open communication if you dismiss opinions and if you don't validate. I think that sometimes the moments when you're talking to your children that are not emotional, that are not kind of within the realm of this discussion, are also important and can build the right environment. So I can see a question in the chat relating to conflict with a child who doesn't understand my point of view and the fact that it's my job to keep them safe. If that's a high charged moment and you're attempting to keep them safe and they don't understand why, it's quite difficult to manage. But let's just imagine that at other times, you've talked to your children when they're completely regulated and a completely normal day. You've talked to them about keeping them safe. A moment where you've done something to keep them safe that's not emotionally charged, and you've said, look, you do know that I'm doing this in order to keep you safe, and that's my most important job as a parent. And they'll probably turn around and say, yeah, of course, I know about this. Yeah, of course, I understand that. So then that when it gets around to that difficult moment where you're telling them, no, you're not doing that, no way you're doing that, and they're responding, but why, and they're not going to listen to reason, you can perhaps refer back to that calm moment where you explained that your main job was safety, to say, I've told you about this before. This is a matter of keeping you safe. Maybe right now you're not getting it, but you do know that that's my most important job because you said it yourself, at whatever moment, and that can then you can use that lever that you've created almost that they remember in order to try to bring them around.
Amazing, thank you. I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap the session up. The first one is, can you share a few practical approaches to make sure we don't use fix you phrases or judgmental ones? So what are some practical approaches that parents can take?
So I can think of some. I think it ties back to the open communication as well, like Steve and you were saying, right? So in order to not use fix you phrases or judgmental ones, we as parents also need to be open to our children's and their perspective and their ideas, right? And it's a trust and it's also respecting what they are saying as well, to a certain extent. So if you think about it, if they say something that is not in line with what we are thinking, but we respect that and we say, okay, it's not in line with what I'm thinking about, but I'll respect what you are saying. I'll listen to you as well, correct? So it's more a parent internal work that we also need to do to be mindful of the conversation. It's not a top-down approach, it's a talk together approach, right? So in terms of practical approaches, it's doing it like what Steve said, in a moment when there is a lot of excitement, positivity, happy as well. It's setting it up during those times, right? It's also being mindful not to put our expectations onto the child and being fixated on it. It's okay to have some expectations of our children, but not to get too tied up with that. Yeah. Is there anything else, Steve? Yeah.
But children want to be heard. They want to be respected. They want their opinions to be taken on board. And so we need to be open. Sometimes they see things that we don't, and actually they come up with the best solution. And so we must be mindful of that it's not a question that we're always right, because actually sometimes we're not, and actually that they're right. And if we can identify those moments whereby actually we've got the space to adapt and say, hey, actually, I didn't think about it like that. Yes, maybe we can do it like that. Maybe we can change that. Then again, that environment of trust builds up and confidence builds up. And it just makes it so much easier when there's a situation where you have to say no. And then you can refer back to those other moments to say, hey, remember situation A? I listened. You had a different way of doing things, and we did it like that because you were right, and it was a good idea. And remember this other time, situation B, etc. However, I'm sorry, but this time it's not the case. This time I must insist, and so it's almost showing them that there's a balance, and that sometimes things are going to work out the way that we want them to, and other times that they're not. And then I guess there's a bluntness of sometimes you have to use your authority at that point to say, and I'm going to have to call it on that one because I'm the adult. It might not feel so comfortable to you, but I'm calling it, and that's okay. We can't move away from a situation of parents deciding everything and dictating everything, as might have happened many years ago, to a state now where children dictate everything and we just move to whatever they want in order to take away that negative experience. There's a middle ground.
Middle ground. Beautiful. And then I think the last question is how to manage. Okay, I think we've gone over this. There's an interesting question. Is there any role for spanking? So I think if we could address this.
That's up to you. I think that in my world, no, but that's very subjective opinion. I have my way of working, and in my house with my children, and I think that I've got plenty of strategies that I could use that would avoid that circumstance. And I think that spanking is the ultimate form of showing the child that you are in control, but it's the ultimate. And I personally don't feel that it ever should get to that. However, I'm an open person, and I do know that there are differing opinions, and I would absolutely not want to stand here and say that this is the definitive truth. And I think that that you'll have to find your way in that.
Mm. And then what about you covered that? What's your
Yeah, so agreeable with Steve that from a psychological perspective, it's a no for spanking because you need to think about what's the message you're sending across to the child. What exactly are you modeling as well? Are you teaching them a lesson? Are you teaching them, okay, if someone makes a mistake, we hit them? So is that the message we are also sending to the child, who may then take that message, go out, oh, my friend made a mistake, I'm going to hit them, right? But also the emotional damage that spanking can do, when someone hits you, right? There is a certain emotional difficulty that arises in the child as well, correct? So it's a no from a psychological perspective. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your answers, and thank you for your insights through this whole conversation. It's been such a eye-opening conversation, and we've covered so much ground today, from understanding how emotional regulation develops to spotting the signs of emotional overwhelm, and learning how parents and caregivers can respond with empathy and support. And I think today's session really highlighted that emotional development is an ongoing journey, and like we touched on a few times, is very independent to each child. There is no one size fits all. There is no set timeline, and it's all about gauging with meeting our children where they're at. So before we go, attendees, please don't forget to check out the parenting section on the EtonHouse website. You can also reach it at parenting.etonhouse.edu.sg. You'll find ebooks, guides, and podcasts on all things parenting. And we'll also send you a recording of today's session by email. Feel free to revisit it or share it with your friends and fellow parents. And once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope you are now leaving feeling more confident and equipped to support your child's emotional growth through the many ups and downs of childhood and adolescence. But overall, take care. And once again, thank you so much, Steve and Kavita, for joining us today and for sharing your expertise. I'm sure that we all learned so much.